Hi, folks. Welcome back. I hope you're all doing well. So, I think it was Paul Graham that said that coming up with a good abstraction is very, very hard. And they seem obvious in retrospect when you use them after the fact. But a good abstraction has to walk that fine line between capturing the common parts of some ad hoc activity that you were doing before you had the abstraction, yet leaving enough room for flexibility and variability that it can be applied in many contexts and is actually useful and not too rigid. And it is with that framing in mind that I want to talk about what Anthropic released recently, Claude Skills. We've been gradually discovering the abstractions that let us productively work with and build systems on top of LLMs. And I think Skills is one of those abstractions. First, just let's look at what Claude Skills actually are. Their own blog post does a great job of describing it, but at a very high level, a skill is a pre-packaged collection of instructions and context and prompts, along with artifacts like example code or example HTML or UI for a very specific purpose. Sam Whitveen had a really great video covering this where he calls skills SOPs for agents, standard operating procedures for agents. And I think that is a very apt comparison. I'll link to his video in the description. Another somewhat similar way to think about them is that they're pre-packaged capabilities that you can use without having to put in really long prompts. But I think one can get a really good understanding of what skills are and how they work by looking at Anthropic's skills GitHub repo that they opened up along with the release of Anthropic Skills. And this repo actually contains multiple skills, not just one skill. If you were making a skill, that repo would have what is one subdirectory in this repo. So let's look at one specific skill. We're going to look at document skills, and within it, it has a skill for dealing with PDF files. And here you see how this is just a markdown file. It has some front matter. This front matter is what helps the LLM choose the right skill depending on the context and what the user is asking for. And the front matter is very short. It just has a name and a short description. So this is similar to tool descriptions and how LLMs pick tools based on descriptions. But then the rest of the PDF covers everything the model needs to know to handle PDF files reliably and capably. And it really spells out a lot of stuff and doesn't leave stuff up to chance. So for example, it has tons of these code snippets as examples of how to do specific tasks with PDFs. So, this code snippet for merging PDFs and this one for splitting PDFs. And it spells out what libraries to use, what classes to use. So you're not depending on the LLM at runtime to go and use its own world knowledge or maybe do web searches to find the best libraries to deal with PDFs. You're actually just telling it. And these instructions can be pretty detailed. For example, here they break out into a separate markdown file instructions for how to do form filling inside PDFs. And they even have a full example script in here. Now, the interesting thing in this markdown file is that it spells out the steps required to reliably fill out forms in PDF. So every step is spelled out in sequence and explained in great detail. And this is what is very much like an SOP. And then within the skill, you have a scripts directory, which comes with a bunch of pre-written Python code. For example, here's a pre-written Python script to fill out fields in a PDF. So a skill really is the output of a lot of intentional effort by the skill author. As you saw in that PDF skill, they've really gone deep on all the actions one might want to do on a PDF, and then how best to reliably perform those actions, along with tons of pre-written scripts and code and step-by-step instructions. And now it is this pre-packaged set of abilities to handle PDFs. So given something like skills, what does the LLM application stack look like? At the very lowest level, you have your grounding, your data sources. It could be databases, APIs, or documents. I didn't make a rectangle for that. And the way you bring all these grounding sources to your LLM is via MCP. So MCP was a crucial abstraction of how to get grounding information to LLMs in a structured and well-defined manner. And that was a really great abstraction. So Anthropic is going 2 for 2 over here. And then on top of your grounding and your MCPs, you have a ton of stuff. And this is where a lot of LLM AI engineering is happening today. You have things like instructions and prompts. You have agent harnesses that do planning and reasoning and handle tool calls down to these MCP servers and decide what to do with the results of those tool calls and then keep iterating until you get some kind of success. And lately, we've been referring to all of these things, the practice of handling all these things in an engineering discipline. We've been calling that context engineering. So on top of the grounding, you do a ton of context engineering, and that's what controls your conversation with the LLM. And of course, on top of all this, you have your actual application that the user sees and interacts with. I think where skills fit in is taking away a big chunk of this context engineering box, at least the chunk that isn't related to just a generic agent harness, the chunk that's related to a specific task that you want to accomplish. Okay, we have to take a slight tangent or aside over here because recently Anthropic also put out what is a very similar abstraction to skills, and it was called Claude Code plugins. And this is a somewhat more limited abstraction in that, as the name suggests, it's only usable in Claude Code. Skills are usable throughout all the various surfaces, like the CLI agent as well as Claude.ai on the web or the apps and so on. But Claude Code plugins are basically like sharing your Claude Code config or dot files. So you've probably seen tons of YouTube videos or Substacks or blog posts about people talking about their custom slash commands, their custom sub agents, and putting them in GitHub repos for other people to share. But there wasn't a standard way of doing it. You'd basically have to clone that repo and kind of put those slash commands and sub agents into your own local Claude Code config. Claude Code plugins is simply a standard way for people to share their Claude Code setups. So if I wanted to put out my custom slash commands and sub agents, I would put it into a repo, a public repo, following this plugin format, and anyone that wanted to use it could simply point Claude Code at the URL for my repo, and it would just have all of these things. Now, it's similar to skills because these are essentially skills for the Claude Code CLI. It's just a very similar abstraction with a slightly different name and limited only to Claude Code. But I think some of the basic ideas behind it are very similar. And that brings me to my hot take, which is that 80 to 90% of the agents that we see and use today are actually just skills. If you look at things like deep research agents or customer service agents or various workflow kinds of agents, all of those things can be encoded with skills because, as you saw, skills can have custom instructions. They can actually spell out a step-by-step workflow just in natural language. And they can even bring code such that you can predefine these solutions and carry them out in a repeatable and reliable manner. And an even more controversial take is that if you look at the kinds of agents that people are writing in a framework like, say, LangGraph, where you have this notion of nodes and edges between those nodes, I would claim that a lot of those kinds of agents can also simply be encoded as skills with some combination of NatLang and maybe very specific code where you want to accomplish certain narrow, well-defined things like we saw in that PDF skill example. Then you might say, well, if most agents that we work with today can be expressed as skills, what's left? What are real agents supposed to be? How are they supposed to be written? Or what capabilities do real agents have that skills don't have? And there are actually a couple of important limitations that skills have, at least the way they are framed today, that real agents should not have. The biggest one is that skills are static. So you package up your skill as a GitHub repo and it has all these instructions and code and so on, but they're still static, which means that you cannot improve and change them over time or at runtime or in response to user feedback. And that gets into this huge area of memory and learning and improvement. And while these are separate ideas, they are all very related and usually go together when you're trying to build agents. What do I mean by memory and learning and improvement? Basically, you want a quote unquote real agent to learn and improve over time. If you listen to the Dwarkesh podcast, he talks about this a lot. He calls it continual learning, which is that I want to be able to point out things to my agents. I want to be able to correct their mistakes and give them feedback and point them in different directions and then have them learn from those things I've told them and remember them. So at least as they're framed right now, skills do not have this capability, and that is basically the next frontier of what agents need to do. All right, so that was a quick look at Claude Skills, a cool new abstraction for building agents. I hope you found that helpful, and I will see you next time. If you like content like this, consider subscribing, like the video. Thanks.